Thanks, Claire, for the introduction. And I'd like to thank Jen Vic for inviting me to speak today. It's quite an exciting opportunity. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, acknowledge that this is unceded sovereign lands that we meet on today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging leaders. I also want to pay my respects to the people who've lost their lives and suffered as victims and survivors of family violence in our communities, and to recognise that their experiences remain at the forefront of our minds while we do this work. As noted, I am the LGBTI Senior Advisor with Our Watch. I'm working on a project called Prevention in Action, which is funded by the Office of Women. I'm not actually employed for 3 years. I'm only employed for 1 year to do the first year of this project. And before I start to talk about LGBTI family violence prevention, I want to spend a moment to just talk about what that project is and how potentially the people in the room can get involved in that program in the coming years as it develops. The Office of Women have funded 3 streams of this project. One is an LGBTI stream, another is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and children, and another is for seniors. It's looking at how to develop different streams of primary prevention in relation to family violence. The first year of the project, which I'm working on, is to look at scoping the sector in terms of what work is happening already in the family violence space that includes LGBTI people, and also what primary prevention work is happening for that particular community. The idea is to run a community consultation to highlight the concerns and needs of the practitioners working in that space and identify how we can develop a 3-year primary prevention program that focuses particularly on the LGBTIQ community. Part of that work is to identify opportunities and strategies in terms of working with the mainstream family violence prevention sector. So as part of that consultation, we have been asking people to consider what some of their concerns are in regards to exploring primary prevention in family violence. One of the community's main concerns is the pressure to develop an evidence base, and an evidence base that's able to provide a consistent story in relation to what are the drivers in relation to LGBTI family violence. One of the concerns within the family violence space is the lack of prevalence data, and also the lack of understanding in terms of what drives family violence in the LGBTI community. There's a lot of concern that without this kind of data, our ability to influence and change and create cultural change and develop workplace capacity in regards to primary prevention will be hampered. I guess as Claire mentioned at the beginning of the day, was that a lot of our work that we've done in family violence has always been before we've had an established evidence base. Our Watch has been an organisation that has led in the development of a literature review which outlines primary prevention in regards to the LGBTI community, and that was developed in 2017. It still remains one of the, most concrete examples of looking at data and evidence in regards to family violence and what are the implications of both gender and sexuality in terms of how family violence presents itself in that community. So as I said, I'm only working on this project for the first year. In the next 3 years, the project will sit within a community organisation in Victoria, and it will be implemented in terms of focusing on workforce capacity development and capabilities. It seeks to work with mainstream family violence prevention workforce and to embed work practices and strategies to ensure that we're continuing to address LGBTI family violence within our prevention work after the duration of this program. Okay. What I wanted to touch on today, just briefly, is one of the major concerns in regards to how to start working with in the primary prevention space within the LGBTI community. And one of those main concerns is looking at how gender inequality, which we understand is the main driver for family violence in a cisgendered heterosexual context, is considered in an LGBTI space. One of the main concerns that one of the main concerns that have been identified within the workforce is that focusing on LGBTI family violence will disrupt the narrative or the focus on a gendered understanding of family violence. What I really want to emphasise today is that when we consider the drivers in the LGBTI community of family violence, we're not considering a new story in its entirety. What we would consider is that it's a gender plus approach. So the same factors in terms of looking at gender inequality still drive the experiences of family violence in the LGBTI community. However, there's a slightly different story. And that different story requires the consideration of sex, gender, and sexuality. So it's going beyond just looking at a dynamic of gender relations and the impact that that has in terms of driving violence against women. It's looking at the assumptions, the stereotypes, the values, and the roles that are placed upon our identities in terms of sex, gender, and sexuality. One of the main drivers that have been identified in regards to LGBTI family violence has been in relation to what we call heterosexism or cisgenderism. And that is the assumption, heterosexism is the assumption that everyone has heterosexual relationships. It can be an assumption or a form of discrimination that excludes the consideration of people being in same-sex relationships. Cisgenderism is the same in terms of the trans community and assuming that everyone is born into the correct sex and that they present as the sex that they were born with. While at the onset, these considerations seemed complex and complicated. When I consider the workforce, the family violence prevention workforce, and wanting to change and expand the way that we operate in this field, we already have a strong foundation and commonalities within that foundation in terms of how to address the causes of family violence through a gender inequality framework. What we're seeking to develop in this space is a broader understanding that beyond gender inequality, we need to consider how the stereotypes and values in regards to being in the primacy of being in a heterosexual relationship and born into the correct gender affect our experiences within the LGBTI community. I think in terms of presenting here today and wanting to give a bit of an understanding in terms of the cultural change that this work would necessitate in the primary prevention space, we're really wanting to say that we want to bring you with us in the way that we develop and expand the approach to family violence. In the consultation with the key stakeholders that the project that I've been working on has been doing, there has been an enormous amount of concern that the prevention sector would consider, consider needing to start the story again. And what we're really trying to promote is there's no need to start the story again, but there is a need to expand how we understand gender inequality and the way that affects LGBTI people. In terms of saying that, and the importance of taking an intersectional approach, it's not just an understanding of It's not just an understanding of one particular identity or set of identities in the LGBTI community. It's also about recognising the diversity within that. So the diversity of behaviours and identities and relationships, and that these behaviours and relationships may not correlate with a conservative understanding of what same-sex relationships are or trans or non-binary identities present to many of the communities. I lastly want to touch on, in terms of working with the LGBTI community in terms of doing this work is some of the principles in terms of making sure that you create an inclusive space when you're undertaking primary prevention. I think one of the main concerns in this area is how to identify with language when you're wanting to expand your work from just, say, women and children in a primary prevention space to including trans and non-binary people. The issue of language in the LGBTI community is extremely contentious. It's something that you, when you're doing your work, need to consult with that particular community around. The consultation work that I've done so far with our Welsh hasn't specifically approached that topic, and I'm not in a position to really expand upon that today. I'll leave that there. Just going forward quickly to wrap up, we look at principles in terms of how to ensure that you're working with the community appropriately. One of the strategies of undertaking LGBTI primary prevention work is to ensure that you're engaging with LGBTI people from the outset. You're involving them in the planning, designing and implementation of those prevention interventions. The importance of doing that is making sure that people's voices are heard and experiences are understood. When we consider LGBTI family violence, it always needs to be at the forefront of our minds that many of these people and the community itself have experienced different forms of marginalisation and have continued to do that and will continue to do that in the future. So it's extremely important to ensure that when you're attempting to do this work that you keep the community at the centre of the work that you're doing. When you're approaching this work, as we do within the women's space, is to ensure that we're addressing structural drivers of violence against LGBTI people, considering the gender norms and the heterosexism and the harmful gender stereotypes in the same way that we approach and consider the harmful gender roles and the inappropriate values that drive family violence in the mainstream community. Would seek that you take a human rights approach in terms of the primary prevention work that you do. Everyone has a right to feel safe. Everyone has a right to feel respected and included within our communities. A lot of the primary prevention work that could be done within this community is also reinforcing that people's relationships have a right to be respected and included in the work that we do. Their identities identities are to be respected and included in the way that we approach our family violence work. In wrapping up, the one thing that I want to emphasise to the people in the room is that we have started doing primary prevention work in the LGBTI space. We're about to hear from Drummond Street in terms of the Redeserve project, which is a primary prevention project in relation to the trans community. There's been a young person's family violence primary prevention project happening with Women's Health East. There's another one with Barwon Sexual Assault Family Violence Service that also focuses on young people. Our Watch has started this project and will lead this project for the first year before it continues to be implemented in a different community organisation at the beginning of next year. And why I want to emphasise that is that if you're interested in undertaking primary prevention work within the LGBTI space, there are organisations that are already attempting to do this. And we would encourage you to contact us and talk to us about what you're doing and the approach that you're taking. Okay, thank you.